Everyone thinks this was just another frustrating weekend for Max Verstappen in Miami. A slightly off setup, a car that did not quite respond. A driver pushing too hard, but that is not the real story. Because what happened in Miami was not about balance. It was about something far more dangerous trust. And once a driver like Verstappen starts to lose trust in the car, the entire system behind him starts to shake. So here's the question no one is really asking. What if Miami was not a bad weekend, but the first visible crack in Red Bull's dominance? Because if that is true, then this is no longer about one race. It is about what happens next. Now, on the surface, the explanation seems simple. Red Bull came into Miami still expected to be the benchmark. Even with rivals like McLaren and Ferrari closing the gap in recent races, the assumption was still the same. When everything is working, Verstappen wins. And when he does not, there is usually a clear reason. Setup, track conditions, or just a weekend where things do not quite align. Miami looked like one of those weekends. The car did not look as planted. The balance was not as sharp through the slower sections. And Verstappen, as always, was vocal about it. That part is not unusual. Elite drivers are extremely sensitive to changes in car behavior, especially someone like Verstappen, whose driving style depends heavily on front-end confidence and precise rotation. So when he sounds frustrated on the radio, it is easy to assume it is just part of the process. A champion demanding perfection, and if you look at the results alone, the narrative still holds. Red Bull was not suddenly slow, they were just not as dominant. And in modern Formula One, that can happen. Margins are tight, upgrades do not always land perfectly, and rivals are improving faster than ever. So the story most people accepted was simple. Red Bull had an off weekend, Verstappen was not happy. They will fix it, end of story. But here is the problem. If it was just about setup, why did it feel different? Why did the tone change? Why did it feel less like frustration and more like uncertainty? Because there is a difference. Frustration means you know what is wrong. Uncertainty means you do not. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. Because when a driver like Verstappen cannot fully trust what the car is going to do, everything changes. Breaking points become guesses, corner entry becomes hesitation. And the one thing that made Red Bull untouchable disappears confidence. So let me ask you this. If the fastest driver on the grid starts questioning the car, even slightly, like what does that say about the system behind it? And more importantly, what happens if that doubt grows? Because this is where the story starts to move away from what we see on track and into something much deeper. And if you're seeing it too, you already know this is not just about Miami. So before we go further, think about this. Do you still believe Red Bull just had a bad weekend, or does something feel off? Because in the next part, we're going to look at why this moment actually matters and why the stakes are much bigger than they seem. There were moments in Miami that did not fit the story. Not the highlights, not the results, the details. And when you slow those moments down, something starts to feel off. Start with the radio. Verstappen has always been direct, sharp, sometimes aggressive, but controlled. Even when he is frustrated, there is usually a pattern. He identifies the issue, he pushes the team. He adapts. Miami sounded different, shorter responses, less certainty, more questions than answers. At one point, instead of calling out a specific problem, he hesitated. That matters, because drivers at that level do not hesitate when they understand the car. They react. So what changed? Then look at the upgrade package. Coming into Miami, there was expectation, not massive gains, but refinement, stability, more predictability. But the car did not look more predictable. Through the slower corners, the rear stepped out more than expected. On entry, the front did not bite with the same confidence. And that creates a chain reaction. When the front is not reliable, Verstappen cannot commit. When he cannot commit, he cannot extract the limit. So what does he do? He pushes harder. And that is where it gets dangerous. Because pushing a car you do not fully trust does not unlock performance. It exposes instability. So now the question becomes obvious. Was the upgrade misunderstood, or is the direction itself starting to drift? And then there is strategy. Small decisions, easy to ignore, but they add up. Timing, track position, calls that did not fully align with how Verstappen was driving the car in that moment. It is subtle. But when driver feedback and team decisions stop syncing perfectly, that is usually a sign of something deeper. Because Red Bull's dominance was never just about raw speed, it was about alignment. Driver, engineers, car behavior, all moving in the same direction. Miami did not look like that. It looked like small disconnects. Individually, each one is manageable. Together, they start to form a pattern. And here's the uncomfortable part. When patterns start to appear, they usually point to something structural, not random, not temporary. So ask yourself this: why would a team that has been this precise suddenly feel slightly out of sync? Why would a driver who normally speaks in absolutes start sounding uncertain? Because once you connect those dots, the story stops being about one race. and starts being about something shifting underneath. Now, here is where everything changes. This is not about a bad setup. It is not about Verstappen losing form. It is not even about rivals catching up. It is about the foundation. Because Red Bull's real advantage was never just speed, it was control over how the car behaves, control over development direction, control over how Verstappen extracts performance. And what Miami hinted at is that control might be slipping. Not gone, but not absolute anymore. Think about it like this. When a dominant system works perfectly, the driver does not think, he reacts, everything feels predictable. But when that predictability fades, even slightly, the driver starts thinking again. And thinking is slower than instinct. That is the difference between dominating and fighting. So, this is the reframe. Verstappen is not struggling because the car is worse. He is adjusting because the system is no longer as stable as it used to be. And that changes everything, because if the system is drifting, then every race becomes less certain. Every upgrade becomes a question, and every decision carries more risk. So here's the moment where you have to decide, do you still see Miami as an isolated issue or the beginning of a pattern? Because if you see it differently, this is where I want to hear it. What do you think is really happening inside Red Bull right now? Because in the next part, we are going to test this idea. Not with speculation, but with proof. Now let's test this. Because if Miami really was the first visible crack, there should be evidence. Not opinions, not impressions. Patterns start with performance trends. At the beginning of the season, Red Bull still had the edge. Not massive, but clear. Clean weekends, predictable pace. Verstappen able to control races from the front. But as the calendar moved forward, that edge started to compress. In races like Australia and Japan, rivals were not just closer. They were matching Red Bull in specific phases. Corner entry, tire management, mid-stint pace, and that matters because Red Bull's dominance was built on consistency across an entire lap, not just one sector. So when competitors start matching them in pieces, the advantage becomes fragile. Then look at upgrades. Not every update has delivered the same clarity as before. In previous seasons, Red Bull upgrades were almost linear. They added performance without destabilizing the car. Now it feels different. Small gains, but with trade-offs, more speed in one area, less confidence in another. And for a driver like Verstappen, that trade-off is critical because his entire driving model is based on knowing exactly what the car will do at the limit. If that predictability drops even 5%, the effect is bigger than any raw pace gain. And here's something else, compare the gap to teammates. When the car is perfectly aligned with Verstappen, the gap is large but stable. He extracts something unique, but the baseline remains strong. When the system becomes less predictable, that gap can fluctuate because now the difference is not just skill, it is adaptability. And adaptability introduces variance. That is not how dominant systems behave. Dominant systems remove variance. So what does that tell us? It tells us the foundation is no longer as locked in as it used to be. And there is more. Listen to how Verstappen talks about the car now compared to previous seasons. Before, the language was confident, clear, direct. Now it is more conditional. Words like maybe, phrases that suggest adjustment instead of control. That shift is subtle, but it is real. And in Formula One, language often reveals what data does not, because drivers feel the car before engineers fully understand it. So when the driver's tone changes, it is usually early warning. Not the conclusion. Now step back and connect everything. Closing performance gaps, upgrades with trade-offs, subtle disconnects in execution. A driver who sounds less certain, individually, none of these confirm a collapse. Together, they point to drift, and this is where the implication becomes uncomfortable. Because dominance in Formula One does not end suddenly, it erodes quietly, gradually, then all at once. And if Red Bull is entering that phase, then Miami was not the problem. It was the signal. So what does that mean for Verstappen? This is where the story comes full circle. At the start, we asked if Miami was just a bad weekend. Now we have a different question. What happens when a driver who relies on absolute control starts feeling instability in the system around him? Because drivers like Verstappen do not wait for decline, they anticipate it, they adapt early, they make decisions before the results force them to. And that creates a new layer of pressure, not just on performance, but on trust in the team, trust in the direction, trust in the future. And if that trust starts to weaken, even slightly, the consequences are bigger than one season. They affect contracts, they affect team dynamics, they affect the entire grid. So here is the uncomfortable truth. This was never just about Miami. It was about the first moment where Red Bull looked human and Verstappen looked uncertain. Not slow, not defeated, just uncertain. And in a sport built on precision, uncertainty is the most dangerous thing of all. So now it comes down to this. If you are Verstappen and you start to feel that shift, how long do you wait? Do you trust the system to recover, or do you prepare for what comes next? Because if this really is the beginning of something bigger, then the next decision he makes will not just define his career. It might redefine Formula One, and if you have been following this closely, you already know. The next chapter is coming,